Everything you touch, you ruin. The phrase ricocheted across the boardroom table like a glass nobody dared to pick up. Nobody said, "That's your father." Nobody. Not the board, not the investors, not the managers who watched me turn an old beat-up pickup truck into Santa Marina Logistics, Inc. in Dallas, Texas. I didn't respond. I didn't frown. I did what a man does back home when his honor is at stake and words are useless. I stayed silent. That silence was my final gift. My name is Robert Santamarina Donahue, to vendors and neighbors. 35 years building a logistics and material solutions company that started in a garage behind my house in Fort Worth and ended up with warehouses in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. I signed contracts on the tailgate of my pickup. I ate cold turkey sandwiches at midnight to finish invoices. I prayed in front of the little Virgin Mary statue before every major delivery. I didn't go to college, but my son, David, never wanted for anything. Tuition paid, books, an apartment near the University of Texas at Dallas campus. A car before I bought myself a new one. I gave him a seat at the table without asking him what he wanted. I gave him my name, my contacts, my own hands. At first, he seemed to understand. He walked beside me through the warehouse, greeted Mr. Peterson from the foundry. He learned to read margins, inventory, and cash flow. I thought, is he ready? I took him out to eat at the diner, the cozy corner downtown. I introduced him to my drivers, to the secretaries who'd put up with me for years, to the vendors from Oklahoma City who fronted us credit when no one else would. I gave him a legacy without demanding gratitude. But he tasted the growth as a conquest, not an inheritance. It started with gestures, a condescending laugh in meetings. "That's so 90s, Dad," was his favorite line, like canceling contracts with the old partners who sustained us when we didn't even have money for gas. "That's how my generation operates," he said one day, after slashing a supplier's price from Houston so low we almost lost the account. I defended him to the board. He's ambitious. He needs room to run. I kept telling myself that all fathers go through this push and pull between what one builds and what the son wants to tear down just to put his signature on it. Until it wasn't a push and pull anymore. It was erasure. Client appointments became his. The decisions, too. One day I arrived at a meeting and David was already in my chair, the one at the head of the table. No one moved. They ran his slides. My restructure, my new era. I nodded where appropriate. I got my few words in. I asked about the burn rate for a project that didn't make long-term sense. He wouldn't let me finish. "Dad, you ruin everything. You ruin." The room turned cold, like an old church. I lowered my hand. In that room, I understood that to them, I was already the portrait on the wall. That night at the house I paid for in North Dallas, there was no question of, "How was your day?" Laughter behind a door, streaming TV shows, glasses of wine. In the kitchen, only reheated coffee remained, and the echo of my name. I poured myself a cup in silence, walked out to the yard, and saw the oak tree we planted when David was 5 years old. "This tree will still be here when I'm gone," I told him back then. Today, the tree remains. My son doesn't look at his roots. In the U.S., you learn that the family business is a public square. They applaud you there, and they point fingers at you there. I chose the public square of silence. Not out of cowardice, but because in business, as in a parade, a firm step says more than a shout. While they toasted, I called Attorney Thompson, my lawyer for life, the one who was with me when we incorporated the business, when we opened a credit line with the banks, and when we structured the support trust that protected the entire operation. "We're ready, attorney," he said. "Everything in order, Mr. Donahue. The authority is still yours." Many believe that power is the microphone. In this country, Power is the signature before the notary. I was still the only name that mattered on the accounts that truly sustained the company. What David flaunted as guaranteed wasn't a bottomless pit. It was an umbrella for storms, not for whims. Years ago, I set aside a cushion, initially in dollars, now perfectly guarded and valued at 41.4 million pesos, which at the time equaled $2.3 million for emergencies and continuity. And when his games of prestige began, I started reassigning clauses. I had the discretionary power to terminate, reassign, or move without notice, not for revenge, but for the protection of the name that cost me calluses. The next morning, I left early. I bought cinnamon rolls at the Sweet Surrender Bakery, left some dollars for the man cleaning windshields on Highway 75, and sat on a bench facing the Old Town Church. I breathed. On the old cell phone, the one with the numbers that mattered, I confirmed the appointment at the notary's office. I didn't need speeches, I needed seals. At the company, the air already smelled like new money. Loud deals, a coffee bar, photo shoots for the magazine. My garage still smelled of diesel and honesty. That very afternoon, I took the first step that makes no noise, but moves tectonic plates. I activated the process to fold the trust into a secure structure, blind to anyone who didn't know where to look. The attorney barely smiled. He knew my silence wasn't retirement. It was strategy. That night, I returned home. No plate was set for me. Just a message in the group chat. Dinner out. I made myself a cup of strong, dark roast coffee, opened the garage door, and stood in the workshop, looking at the old blueprints taped to the wall. I fell asleep there in my recliner, just like when the company was barely breathing. And just before closing my eyes, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't argue in his language anymore. I would speak in mine, the language of signatures. The next day, when David stood up to announce the new era to the board, I had already set mine in motion. It was simple, legal, impeccable. And when the machinery he boasted about began to sputter without the lung it never valued, he would understand that silence here is not surrender. It's a judgment. Over the following days, the house in North Dallas became a silent stage, not of peace, but of exclusion. No one left the coffee ready anymore. I didn't hear the classic, "How'd you sleep, Dad?" that David's wife, Sarah, used to offer with a polite smile. Now, barely a murmur as I passed in the hallway, a dry, "Excuse me," as she crossed toward the kitchen. The echo of the refrigerator closing was my new conversation. I am not a man of scandals. I learned that here, noise is made by those who fear losing power. Those who truly have it move the pieces silently. So while David played the modern executive with his partners from New York City, I continued my routine. I woke at dawn, swept the patio, fed the 2 cats that always lingered by the gate, and prepared a cup of thick, cinnamon-spiced coffee. Then I sat at the wooden desk I built 30 years ago, reviewing the papers my son had forgotten existed. The operating continuity trust remained intact. I held the key. He never asked. He believed inheritance was automatic, as if blood was enough to gain notarized rights. But the signatures before Notary Number 12 of Dallas, sealed by Attorney Thompson, still named me as the irrevocable title holder and beneficiary. Everything he thought he controlled was merely a decoration on a floor I could lift whenever I chose. One afternoon, I saw him arrive in an Italian suit, phone in hand, speaking loudly. "No, Dad. I don't need you to review those numbers. I know what I'm doing." "I just want to make sure you're not compromising the liquidity," I replied. "Please," he said without even looking at me. "This isn't the old days." And he locked himself in his office. I heard him laughing on the phone, telling someone the company was more alive than ever thanks to his management. There was arrogance in his voice, not youth. I squeezed the mug so hard the coffee spilled onto my pants, but I didn't say a word. A father's pride sometimes becomes his condemnation. That night, while they had dinner upstairs with music and wine glasses, I went down to the workshop. The smell of oil, metal, and dampness reminded me of the years when I slept there on cardboard just to ensure a delivery wasn't missed. I touched the tools, the stained blueprints, the framed photos of the first pickup truck we bought used in San Antonio. In a corner was the small safe where I kept documents even my accountant didn't know about. I took out a gray folder. Trust, emergency clauses. I opened it calmly, reading every paragraph. I still had the full right to restructure, transfer, or liquidate assets without prior notification. In other words, he didn't have the power. I did. That certainty didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought me sadness, because what I built wasn't just money. It was the symbol that an uneducated man could build something clean in a country where corruption tempts you daily. And now my own son wanted to turn it into a toy to feel important in front of investors. The next day, I invited him to breakfast. I chose the Colonial Grill downtown with a view of the town square. "How's business, son?" I asked while the waiter served waffles and sausage. "Good, better than ever," he replied without looking up from his phone. "Just remember that numbers also have a soul," I said. "Not everything is measured in margin." He let out a short laugh. "Dad, that's old school. This isn't a dive bar, it's a modern corporation." He picked up his imported cappuccino cup and kept typing. In that instant, I knew the conversation was over before it started. I paid the check, left the tip, and walked down Main Street among tourists and street musicians. I stopped in front of a window with pottery figures and thought, my son didn't inherit my hands. He inherited my foundation, but he doesn't know how to care for it. That night, I lit a candle in front of the portrait of Lucy, his mother. I spoke to her softly, as if she could still hear me. "You gave him tenderness. I gave him discipline. And still, look what he became." The wind moved the flame, and I felt it was an answer. That's when I decided what I would do. There would be no shouting, no lawsuits, no revenge. Just a clean legal move that would put everything in its place. On Monday at 9 o'clock in the morning, I called Attorney Thompson. "Activate the passive transfer clause," I told him. "Are you sure, Mr. Donahue? It's irreversible." "More sure than ever," I answered. "I want the trust to stop backing the operations. I want it to become inactive." Silence on the other end of the phone. Then a sigh. "Understood. We will proceed according to law." I hung up. I looked at my reflection in the workshop window. The man I saw was no longer the founder, the businessman, or the wounded father. He was the architect of his own closing, and while David toasted his success, the foundation of his empire began to disappear, dollar by dollar, signature by signature. The following days dragged by, as if time was also observing me cautiously. At home, everything seemed the same. Lights on late, the laughter of David and Sarah coming up the stairs, the aroma of steaks on the grill on weekends. But there was something different, invisible, like a crack in the air. I knew the change had already begun, even though they were still living in the illusion of plenty. Attorney Thompson called me on Thursday morning. "Mr. Donahue, the process is underway. In 3 weeks, the trust will be inactive." "Thank you, attorney," I replied, pouring coffee into my old earthenware mug. "Let everything be done in silence. No notifications, no alarms. It will be so." I hung up and stared at the coffee steam. What I felt wasn't revenge. It was something older. Dignity. The man I had been for 35 years wasn't going to die as a guest in his own legacy. That afternoon, David hosted a party at the house. Luxury cars arrived, loud laughter, expensive perfumes. From the workshop, I heard fragments of conversation. "The old man is retiring now," one said. "About time, buddy. He doesn't understand how things move anymore," another replied. I clenched my fists, but didn't go out. When a man decides to leave the stage, he doesn't do it out of weakness, but out of strategy. And I had learned that here, silence is way more than speeches. The next morning, I received an unexpected visit. Ms. Helen, the accountant who had worked with me since the tough years. She came with an envelope in her hand and a look of worry. "Mr. Donahue, I received new emails from your son. He wants to make big moves, sell off some of the inventory from Memphis, and advance payments to vendors I don't even know." "Don't worry," I told her calmly. "Only do what is signed by me." She nodded, but her eyes said something else. Fear. Because she knew the pattern. She knew that when I spoke softly, the earthquake was already underway. After she left, I walked to the garage. I sat in my recliner, the same one where I slept when we were starting the company. I opened a leather-bound notebook. On the first page, in firm handwriting, I wrote what David never understood. And I began to jot down everything he had never wanted to hear. The loans I co-signed personally, the vendors who trusted me because they believed in me, the friendships that sustained the business when we had no liquidity. They weren't accounting notes. They were the foundations of my life. While I was writing, I heard footsteps. It was Sarah. "Robert," she said without smiling, "David needs you to sign the authorization to open a new credit line. He says it's urgent." "Urgent for whom?" I asked without looking up. "For the company." "The company doesn't have urgencies. It has memory. And that memory is still in my name." She pressed her lips together, annoyed. "I don't understand why you resist letting him do his job. You're not up for these things anymore." "Perhaps," I replied, "but I'm still the owner." She left without saying goodbye, and I, for the first time in years, smiled. Not out of happiness, but out of certainty. Respect isn't demanded with shouts. It's recovered with invisible actions. At dawn on Sunday, I drove to Fredericksburg. I needed to breathe away from the noise. I sat on a bench in front of the church and bought a cream cheese pastry. The air smelled of damp earth. Sometimes I think the silence of small towns knows how to keep secrets better than any lawyer. While the roosters crowed, I opened my phone and sent a short message to Attorney Thompson. "Proceed with the unlinking of secondary accounts. Immediate effect." That line of text was like pulling a fine thread that holds an entire tapestry together. You can't see it, but it changes everything. When I returned to Dallas, the atmosphere at the company was already starting to get tense. I heard rumors of angry vendors due to delayed invoices that didn't balance. David, as always, attributed it to system failures. The system wasn't failing. The system simply wasn't supporting him anymore. That night, I prepared a strong coffee and went out into the yard. The oak tree we planted together still stood tall, its leaves rustling in the wind. I spoke to it as if it were Lucy. "He thinks this is punishment. It's not. It's a lesson. In this country, you can lose money, but not your word. And mine is still worth more than his signature." I looked toward the house lights. They were laughing inside. I, on the other hand, was enjoying the purest sound there is, the sound of a fall that hasn't been heard yet, but has already begun. Monday dawned with a thick air, the kind that announces a storm even if the sky looks clear. I arrived at the office early, as usual. But this time, no one greeted me with the customary, "Good morning, Mr. Robert." The secretaries lowered their voices. The accountants avoided my gaze. The rumor was already circulating. The payments hadn't arrived. I entered my office. Everything was the same, except for one subtle difference. The picture of me, the one where David and I were inaugurating the new plant in Fort Worth, was no longer hanging. In its place was an empty space, a square absence. Perfect. I poured myself a black coffee from the old steel thermos and waited. At 9:15, David burst in without knocking. Expensive suit, gleaming watch, and the tone of someone who feels like they own the world. "Dad, do you know the payroll payment was delayed?" "I know." "What do you mean you know?" "The trust had enough funds to cover 3 months." "It had," I corrected, using the past tense. His smile froze. "What did you do?" "What a man must do when his name is being used as currency. Protect it." David paced the office like a caged animal. "You can't do that. This company is mine too." "Not yet, son. For that, you have to earn something you lost. Trust." He slammed his open palm onto the desk. "This is sabotage." "No," I said. "Calm down. It's a consequence." For the first time, I saw something more than contempt in his eyes. Fear. And I understood that deep down, he already knew the truth. He had been playing with a castle held up by my name. That afternoon, 3 vendors called me. One from Oklahoma City, another from St. Louis, another from Kansas City. All of them said the same thing. "Your son is promising payments that aren't arriving." I asked them to stay calm. I told them everything would be cleared up soon. And though my voice sounded firm, I felt a stab of nostalgia inside. Because those men had trusted me when I didn't even have an office. And now they had to endure the arrogance of a boy who confused legacy with loot. I decided to go see them personally. I took my 2008 Chevy Impala, the same one I used when the company was barely breathing, and drove out onto Interstate 45. On the way, I remembered entire nights sleeping in cheap motels, carrying invoices and dreams in the glove compartment. I remembered Lucy waiting up for me with chicken soup and the children asleep. When did everything break? Maybe the day David stopped calling me Dad and started saying Robert in meetings. When I reached Oklahoma City, I ate at a roadside diner. Barbecue tacos, a glass bottle of soda, a waxed paper napkin. The owner recognized me. "Aren't you the one from Santa Marina?" "I was," I replied. "Good man, always paid on time." "I try to keep being one." That phrase hurt more than I expected. On the way back to Dallas, I received a call from Sarah. "Where are you?" "David is furious. He says you destroyed everything you built together." "Together?" I asked with a bitter laugh. "When was the last time you two built anything without my foundation?" She didn't answer. The silence on the other end of the phone was so long I could hear her breathing tremble. I hung up without saying goodbye. That night when I got home, there was no light in my room. They had disconnected it. Ah, so the silent war has begun, I thought. I lit a candle, opened the window, and looked out at the yard. The oak tree was still there, strong, stubborn, just like me. I took out a notebook and wrote, "The collapse began today, not because I caused it, but because they believed they could live on air." 2 days later, Attorney Thompson confirmed. "The trust has been officially liquidated, Mr. Donahue, and the transfers redirected to the new structure under your exclusive control. No one else can access it." I stayed silent, looking at the signed papers. I didn't feel triumph, just a strange calm, thick like when thunder sounds far away and you know the rain won't be long. A few hours later, I received a message from David. I need to talk to you. Urgent. Don't do anything else until we reach an agreement. I didn't reply. I just put the phone face down and kept working. Because there are silences that destroy empires faster than 1,000 words. And that night, for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. The next morning, the tension could be cut with a knife. Messages, calls, emails poured in from early on. The entire company was in chaos. The Treasury Department couldn't explain why the funds weren't showing up. Vendors demanded answers, and the bank wanted to speak with the legal representative of the trust. That representative was me. And no one but Attorney Thompson knew it. I turned on the workshop radio while making coffee. The news spoke of politics, football, everything but what mattered to me, the end of an era. For the first time in many years, I felt the weight of my own freedom. I had let go of the reins, but also the chains. At 10 o'clock sharp, David burst into the workshop. This wasn't the confident young man who had humiliated his father in front of investors. This was a man with a pale face and a broken voice. "Dad," he said, using a tone he hadn't used in years, "I need to know what you did. The payments, the contracts, everything is stalled." "Nothing that wasn't mine from the beginning," I replied without getting up from the bench. "This could destroy us." "We were already destroyed, son. You just didn't know it yet." He stood there, breathing hard, searching for arguments he couldn't find. I continued sanding a piece of wood, the same piece I'd been turning into a St. Joseph figure for days. "What did you expect me to do?" I asked him. "Applaud while you turned my work into your trophy?" "It's not fair," he whispered. "Fair? What was fair was that you learned to be grateful before giving orders." David lowered his gaze. For an instant, I saw the boy who once accompanied me on deliveries on Sundays, eating barbecue sandwiches in the trunk of the Chevy. But that boy no longer existed. The man standing in front of me was learning what no MBA teaches, that arrogance is also paid for in dollars. That afternoon, the house in North Dallas felt bigger than ever. Sarah wouldn't speak to me. She slammed doors shut. She spoke in low tones on the phone. Passing the living room, I overheard, "Yes, Mom, I think it's over. There's no more money. No, I don't know what the old man did." The old man. That's what they called me now. Not Robert. Not Mr. Robert. Not Dad. I went to the kitchen, poured a bowl of cold soup, and sat alone, as so often lately. Forced laughter came from the dining room upstairs, the echo of music that couldn't quite conceal the fear. I wasn't in a hurry. I knew the following days would be the real test. 2 mornings later, I received the call from Attorney Thompson. "Mr. Donahue, everything is closed. The trust no longer figures in the operating accounts. Legally, you have no outstanding obligations." "Perfect," I replied. "Keep the documents safe. And if anyone asks, I don't exist." I hung up and stared at the city from the workshop window. The sun beat down on the roofs of Dallas, bright and cruel. I thought of all the men of my generation who had worked in silence, sustaining family businesses that their sons later sold for ego or modernity. At least I wouldn't be one of them. That afternoon, I went for a walk to the town square. I sat on the same bench where I had waited for Lucy 30 years ago, when we were still young, dreaming of buying our first pickup. Around me, people passed without knowing who I was, without imagining that the man in the hat and denim shirt had just erased an empire with a single signature. And for the first time in a long time, I felt light. Upon returning home, I found a note taped to the workshop door. It was David's handwriting. "Dad, please, let's talk. Tell me how to fix this. I don't want to lose everything." I stared at it for a long while. I didn't tear it up. I just put it in my pocket next to Lucy's crossed necklace. I went up to my room, opened the window, and let the afternoon wind in. I knew the moment was fast approaching. They would discover that the company could survive. But not without the foundation I had built. And when that happened, they would finally understand the lesson that took me half a century to learn. Money is inherited. Respect, never. Monday dawned gray, with a wind that whistled through the neighborhood trees as if carrying bad news. I was not mistaken. By mid-morning, my phone vibrated constantly. Messages from the accountant, the plant manager, even the bank. One after another, all with the same phrase, disguised as formality. There are irregular movements. We need your authorization. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee and let them ring. I no longer had anything to authorize, only to watch the curtain fall on the play I had written myself. Around noon, David appeared in the workshop again, but this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Sarah with a hardened expression and a young lawyer who introduced himself with a trembling voice. "I'm Mr. Torres, your son's legal representative." "Legal for what?" I asked without moving from my chair. "To ask for forgiveness or to make demands?" David stepped forward. "Dad, we have to clear this up. The company can't operate. The accounts are frozen. The banks are asking for your signature." "Of course they are," I replied. "I never stopped being the principal signatory." The silence fell like a stone. Sarah looked at the lawyer, seeking help. "We want to reach an agreement," he said. "If you reactivate the trust, your son commits to keeping you as an honorary partner." "Honorary?" I repeated with a bitter smile. "I spent half my life working like a donkey, just to be offered a paper medal now?" David tensed up. "Dad, don't you understand? This isn't personal. It's business." "No, son, that's exactly your mistake. Everything I built was personal. Every brick, every client, every truck. Companies that last aren't built on excuses. They're built with soul, and you sold yours at the first round of applause." The lawyer intervened with useless diplomacy. "Mr. Donahue, the situation is serious. Without cash flow, the employees could sue." "Let them sue," I said. "At least they'll know who they were truly serving." Sarah broke the silence with a sharp voice. "Is that what you wanted? To see him ruined?" "Your own son? I didn't ruin him. I just took away what wasn't his." She started to reply, but David stopped her with a gesture. "Let's go," he said. "It's not worth it." And they left, without looking back. When the gate closed, the workshop filled again with that thick silence I knew so well. I turned on the radio. A song by Johnny Cash played softly, like an echo from another era. The money runs out, but the word doesn't. I remembered that phrase my father used to tell me in the 70s when we loaded cement bags under the San Antonio sun. And I smiled, because life, even though cruel, has a perfect sense of humor. 2 days later, Ms. Helen, the accountant, arrived, her eyes puffy. "Mr. Donahue," she said with a shaky voice, "they fired him." "Who? David?" "The board removed him. The investors left. The contracts fell apart in a chain reaction." "It was a matter of time," I replied. "A tree without roots doesn't last through the rainy season." She sat across from me, and for a moment, she was the same 20-year-old girl who helped me file invoices when we barely had a desk. "And what will you do now, Mr. Donahue?" "Finally, nothing. And let the company stay silent for a while. The noise is what killed it." She nodded, holding back tears, and said goodbye with a hug. I was left alone, watching the dust suspended in the sunbeam coming through the window. That dust was the remnants of an empire, and at the same time, the seeds of my peace. That night, David wrote again. Dad, I was wrong. Forgive me, just tell me how to start over. I read the message several times. Then I turned off the phone. Not out of cruelty, but because some answers need silence to truly hurt. I went to the yard, sat under the oak tree, and looked at the stars. Lucy would have cried, I know. But she would have understood too, because sometimes a father must choose between saving his son and saving the dignity he taught him. And I had already made my choice. The Dallas sun was hotter than usual that Tuesday. I was in the workshop sorting old tools and reviewing yellowed invoices when I heard a knock on the gate. They were 3 firm knocks from someone who wasn't coming to visit, but to settle accounts. I opened it. There stood David. No suit, no escort, no arrogance, just a tired man with sunken eyes and slumped shoulders. "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded. He walked in silently, looking at the place as if seeing it for the first time. The same workshop where he learned to use a hammer, where I taught him to negotiate with the construction workers, where one day I told him, "Never fail the person who trusts your word." But words weigh more when they are forgotten. We sat across from each other. The old fan buzzed, keeping the rhythm of the silence. "Everything fell apart," he finally said. "The contracts, the credit lines, the employees, everyone left." "I know," I replied without surprise. "You said you did it to protect the company. But the company no longer exists." "No, son. I did it to protect the name. The company was just the body. The name was the soul. And what good is the name if no one mentions it anymore? It's good so that when you look in the mirror, there's still someone you recognize." David took a deep breath. "I don't know when you became my enemy." "I never did," I said calmly. "You were the one who declared war when you told me I ruined everything I touched." He ran his hands over his face. His eyes were red, his face unshaven. For the first time in many years, I saw the boy who feared disappointing me. Not the arrogant executive, but the son looking for a compass. "I didn't know what I was doing," he admitted softly. "I thought you were stuck, that it was up to me to modernize everything." Modernizing isn't forgetting, David. In this country, you can paint new facades. But if you forget the foundation, the house falls with the first tremor. "I know," he said. "I lost everything trying to prove I could do it alone." He took an envelope from his backpack and placed it on the table. "This is for you. It's the papers, the company, the land, the house. Everything. I don't want anything anymore." I looked at him without touching the envelope. "I didn't come for that," he continued. "I came because I don't know what to do anymore. Everyone turned their backs on me. Even Sarah left to be with her mother." That last sentence sounded more like a confession than a complaint. And while a part of me felt pity, another, deeper part just thought, that's how it should be. Sometimes losing everything is the only thing that forces us to look inside ourselves, I told him. And what do I do with that? Start by saying you're sorry, not to me, to those who trusted you, to the employees you fired without looking them in the eye, to the vendors you misled. And when you finish, if you still have a voice left, then come back. And we'll talk as father and son, not as victims. David nodded in silence. He didn't cry, but his eyes did so internally. He stood up, looked at the oak tree in the yard, and murmured, "Remember when we planted it? You said it would give us shade someday." "And it did," I replied. "You just failed to stand still for a while to enjoy it." Before leaving, he stopped at the door. "Dad, do you think I can start over?" "Everyone can, but not everyone learns." When the gate closed, the air in the workshop hung suspended. I sat down again at the table, opened the envelope. Inside were the deeds and a handwritten note. I didn't know how to take care of what you gave me. Thank you for teaching me, even though it hurt. I put the envelope away without reading it again. It wasn't a time for resentment or tenderness. It was a time for silence. That night, as the wind rattled the oak tree leaves, I understood that the true inheritance isn't in the millions or the names engraved in bronze. It's in the lesson that survives when everything else collapses. And mine, though late, had finally germinated. But silence is not always the end. Will David dare to return, not for money, but to rebuild what truly matters, blood and one's word? 2 weeks passed since that conversation in the workshop. I heard nothing more from David. No calls, no messages, no visits. Only the distant murmur of neighbors saying they had seen him sell his truck in the neighborhood and move to a small apartment near Central Park. The boy who once believed he had the world in his hands now barely had a modest roof and a borrowed mattress. And yet, something in me felt relief. Because the blows of life that don't kill teach. And I trusted this was the first one that really opened his eyes. One morning, while buying cinnamon rolls at the Sweet Surrender Bakery, I ran into Ms. Helen. She had flour on her apron and a sad smile. "I saw him, Mr. Donahue," she said softly. "Your son is looking for work. Work, yes. At a transport company in the industrial park. They didn't hire him. They say no one wants to risk employing him now." I kept silent. Pride and compassion wrestled inside me, like two old enemies who couldn't decide whether to kill each other. I paid the baker, took my change, and walked slowly back home. Passing the old town church, I went inside. I lit a candle for Lucy and another for David. Not so he would recover what was lost, but so he would find meaning in what remained. Because there are prayers that don't ask for miracles, but for understanding. That same afternoon, as the sun was setting behind the hills, I heard a knock at the door. It was David. His appearance was different. No watch, no suit, with a rolled-up shirt and hands stained with grease. In his face, a mix of exhaustion and humility. "I got a job," he said before I could ask. "At a mechanic's shop in West Dallas. They don't pay much, but they let me keep the extra hours." "That's good," I replied. "I'm learning to do things with my hands. Real things." It was about time. He smiled shyly, like when he was a child showing me a crooked drawing and saying it was a house for us. "I didn't come to ask you for anything," he continued. "I just wanted you to know that I'm fine, that I'm starting over." I invited him in. We sat at the patio table under the shade of the oak tree, the same tree that had witnessed all our words, the sweet and the bitter. I served him coffee and a molasses pastry. We didn't talk about money, the company, or the past. Just the weather, work, people. We talked like two men, not like father and son who owe each other apologies. When he got up to leave, he extended his hand. I took it. It was firm but different. The hand of someone who finally knew the weight of earning his bread. "Thank you for not rescuing me," he said without looking directly at me. "If you had, I would still be lost." "I know. And this time, Dad, thank you for letting me fall." I watched him walk down the street, the sun painting his long shadow on the cobblestones. For the first time in years, I felt I could breathe without guilt. Not because I had corrected him, but because he had finally decided to learn. That night, I stayed in the workshop. The air smelled of oil, wood, and damp earth. I turned on the radio, and Elvis Presley's "The King" played. The lyrics brought a smile to my face. With or without money, I always do what I want. And I thought that maybe, without wanting to, I had ended up living like the song. Without money, but with something more valuable. My peace. I turned off the lights, looked one last time at the blueprints hanging on the wall, and whispered, "Lucy." I think the boy finally understood. Then I closed the door and was left listening to the silence. That same silence that used to hurt, and now embraced me like an old friend. But the Donahue Santa Marina story isn't over yet. Because when a son learns to be a man, destiny usually tests whether his lesson was true or just momentary. 3 months passed since that visit. The workshop was bustling again. I continued repairing old furniture for neighbors, cutting wood on weekends, and drinking coffee from the same steel thermos that had been with me all my life. I didn't need anything else. Peace, when it arrives late, is enjoyed as a luxury. But stubborn destiny, as always, never leaves stories incomplete. One Friday afternoon, while inspecting some rusty hinges, Miss Helen arrived with an envelope in her hands. "This came to the company address, Mr. Donahue." "Who is it from?" I asked. "From a law office in New York City, it seems. Your son registered a new company name." I was silent for a few seconds. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter from David in his shaky script. "Dad, I don't want to recover what I lost. I just want to prove to you that I learned the lesson. I'm starting from scratch with a small transport workshop. No loans, no favors, no trusts. Just work and the hands you gave me. If you ever pass by the highway toward Austin, there's a sheet metal sign that says, Lucy's Transport. It doesn't carry my name. It carries Mom's. Because she was the bridge between us. I don't expect you to come or congratulate me. I just want you to know that I finally understood." I kept reading those lines over and over. They weren't many, but every word weighed like a sincere apology. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt gratitude. Gratitude because the right seed had finally sprouted. Humility. The following Sunday, at dawn, I got into the Chevy Impala and headed toward Austin. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and corn tortillas coming off the griddles at the roadside stands. After a few miles, I saw it. A blue gate with a hand-painted sign that read, Lucy's Transport, local and long-haul service. 2 old but clean trucks parked outside, and David, in a cap and denim shirt, directing a group of young men while loading merchandise. I parked on the other side of the street without him seeing me. I watched him for a long time. His movements were precise, careful, like mine in the old days. He gave orders without shouting, greeted everyone with respect, and before getting into the truck, he stopped in front of a small image of the Virgin Mary hanging on the wall. He touched his chest and murmured something. I didn't hear the words, but I understood the gesture. When the truck pulled away, I turned around and drove back to Dallas. I didn't need to speak to him. The mere sight of him working like that was enough. That night at home, I sat under the oak tree and lit a candle. The wind rustled the leaves, and the air carried the smell of damp earth. I thought about everything that had happened. The pride, the fall, the silence, the rebuilding. And I understood that the stories of father and son here are almost always written with the same ingredients: pride, pain, and redemption. Sometimes in that order, sometimes reversed. I picked up David's letter once more, folded it carefully, and put it away in the same box where Lucy's photos rested. "Look, honey," I whispered. "The boy finally found his way. Maybe not as we dreamed, but in his own manner." Then I turned off the light, leaving only the candle burning, and closed my eyes. because I finally understood that he didn't need to come back home. The home now lived inside him. But destiny doesn't close the soul's account so easily. What will happen when David discovers the last secret his father still keeps locked away? Autumn arrived in Dallas with its golden light and that cold air that smells of nostalgia. I continued my simple routine, waking at dawn, making dark roast coffee, opening the workshop, and losing myself in the sounds of the planer and the hammer. My world was small, but calm. Until one morning, the past knocked on my door again, and it did so with the force of a wind that slips through every crack. It was Attorney Thompson. It had been years since he had come in person. We always spoke on the phone. He entered with his measured pace and his worn briefcase. "Mr. Donahue," he said, "we have to talk about something pending." "Pending?" I thought we had closed everything. "Almost everything," he replied, opening his folder. "Do you remember the additional clause of the trust, the one for family contingency?" I nodded, frowning. "What about it?" "It was never executed, and according to the law, you are still the title holder of certain real estate assets, land, warehouses, and a secondary account in San Angelo." I looked at him, confused. "I thought all that had been transferred to the company's name." "No, Mr. Donahue, you never signed the assignment. Did you forget? Technically, they are still yours." "And how much are we talking about?" I asked without much curiosity. The lawyer sighed. "Around $20 million. For a moment, silence filled the workshop. 20 million, a fortune for anyone. But at my age, I felt it like an old shadow returning to weigh me down. "And what do you suggest I do with it?" I asked. "You can transfer it to David if you wish, or donate it. But we need to move it soon before the IRS reactivates the audit." I stared at the floor, not out of greed, but out of something deeper. The fear that this money, if it reached the wrong hands, would unleash the same hell that cost me so much to put out. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed seated under the oak tree, looking at the moon. The wind moved the branches as if murmuring memories. What if I don't tell David anything? I thought. What if I let that money disappear with my name? But then I remembered his letter, his workshop, his effort, the boy who had learned to work with his hands. That new man deserved an opportunity, only this time without knowing it. The next day, I went to see the attorney. "Prepare a document for me," I said. "I want the assets to go to a new foundation. A charitable foundation, yes, but with one detail." I took out a sheet of paper and wrote in my firm handwriting, "Lucy's Foundation, training for low-income young mechanics and transport workers." The lawyer smiled. "And the administrator who runs it?" "David. Without him knowing it was my idea." "Are you sure?" "More than ever. I don't want to leave him an inheritance. I want to leave him a purpose." 2 weeks later, the paperwork was ready. The land, the account, and the warehouses now legally belonged to the foundation. And David's name appeared as the honorary president. I didn't appear on any of the papers. Thompson handed me a copy of the document. When he signs the acceptance, he will know that this time there is nothing to lose or claim. "Exactly," I replied. "I want him to understand that the cleanest wealth is the one born from service, not from a last name." Days later, a message arrived from David. "Dad, I was offered the chance to lead a foundation that trains drivers and mechanics. It's called Lucy's. I don't know who created it, but I feel like it comes from you." I didn't reply. I just looked at the sky and, for the first time in a long time, let out a short, serene laugh. Lucy would have been proud. That night, the workshop smelled of new wood. The oak tree moved slowly in the wind, and I understood that after all, I hadn't lost my son. I just had to let him fall so he could learn to walk. I gripped the coffee mug in my hands, closed my eyes, and whispered, "Now, old man, you can rest." The dawn of December arrived with the cold air descending from Mount Rainier. The workshop smelled of pine and sawdust, and an old Christmas carol played on the radio. I was repairing a chair for the neighbor when I heard the sound of a truck engine stopping outside the house. The sound was familiar, as if the past had pulled up to my door again. I wiped my hands on a rag and went out. It was David, getting out of a pickup with the logo Lucy's Foundation painted on the door. He wore a gray sweater, a growing beard, and a contained smile. "Good morning, Dad." "Good morning, son. Can I come in?" "You always could," I said, opening the gate. He entered the workshop and looked around. His eyes settled on the bench where he used to play as a child with screws and nails. "It's still the same," he said. "Because what works, you don't change." We sat facing each other. He placed a thick folder full of papers on the table. "I came to talk to you about this." He opened it carefully. They were foundation documents, notarial acts, registrations, financial reports. On the first page, a large stamp read, "Original donation, Robert Santamarina." I looked up. Our eyes met, and the silence stretched out, heavy, but not uncomfortable. "You know now, then," I finally said. "I found out yesterday," he replied. "Attorney Thompson called me. He told me everything." "And what did you feel at first?" "Rage, then shame." He paused. "And finally, gratitude." He leaned back in his chair, took a deep breath, and added, "When they offered me the foundation's directorship, I thought it was a coincidence. But when I started working there, something changed. The kids we train, the young mechanics, the people from the neighborhoods, they reminded me of what you always said. It's not about having employees. It's about building people." His voice trembled. "And I understood it, Dad. I finally understood it." I let him speak. I didn't interrupt. I had waited for that moment for so long that I didn't want to spoil it with my words. David continued, recounting how the foundation had grown, how they repaired school buses for rural communities, taught trades, and offered scholarships to young people who couldn't afford tools, and how, without knowing it, every decision carried something I had taught him. "Everything I do now, I do it in silence, just like you," he said. "Silence is the language of those who have learned to listen," I replied. He opened the folder and showed me a final page. It was an honor certificate issued by the City Council, recognizing the foundation for its community work. Below, in small letters, a text read, "In memory of Robert Santamarina and his wife Lucy, whose example of work and dignity gave rise to this cause." I stared at it without saying anything. I never liked tributes. But this one, it had a different flavor. It was the kind of recognition that doesn't seek applause, just justice. "They will officially present it next month," David continued. "I want you to be there." "No, son. That day is yours." "No," he said firmly. "It's ours." For a moment, time seemed to stop. We looked at each other like two men who finally understand each other without having to explain anything. When David left, the workshop was calm. On the table, he left a cardboard box. Inside were photos of the foundation's first students, young men in overalls, sincere smiles, and hands full of grease. There was also a folded letter. I opened it carefully. "Dad, thank you for giving me a second chance," it said, without a signature. Thank you for letting me lose everything to find myself. And above all, thank you for showing me that true legacy is not inherited. It is built by working. Your son, David. The letters were firm, without trembling. The letters of a man who no longer sought forgiveness, but purpose. That night, as the wind rustled the oak tree leaves, I lit a candle next to Lucy's photo and whispered, "It is done, honey." The boy finally learned. Then I poured myself a last cup of dark roast coffee, watched the embers slowly die out, and I understood that the cycle had closed. My company, my mistakes, my silences. Everything had been worth it to reach this moment. January arrived with a quiet, clean air. The days were cold but bright, and in the workshop the wood smelled of hope again. From the window, I watched the neighbors pass with holiday cakes and children running with balloons. Life continued simply, as it should. I no longer expected shocks. But sometimes stubborn destiny, as always, keeps one last twist, just to remind you that you're still alive. One afternoon in February, while sanding a chair, Sarah arrived without warning. She carried a cake wrapped in napkins and a bright smile. "Mr. Donahue, it's your birthday, isn't it?" "Who told you?" "David, of course. And he says that if you don't come to the new center's inauguration, he'll come and carry you there himself." I laughed. "He's still stubborn." "Stubborn, but happy," she replied. "The foundation is growing. There are volunteers in other cities now. They even mentioned it in the St. Louis newspaper." We sat in the yard facing the oak tree. We ate 3 milk cake and talked about everything. The boys in the program, the workshops, the families who now had an income thanks to the trade. I listened to her, and in her voice, I recognized Lucy's strength. That mixture of tenderness and determination that once sustained me when I had nothing. Before leaving, Sarah handed me an envelope. "David asked me to give this to you personally." "And why didn't he come?" "He said he wanted you to read the letter alone so he wouldn't interrupt your silence." I waited for her to leave. Then I opened the envelope with trembling hands. "Dad, today we're inaugurating the center in San Antonio. We named it after you because everyone here feels you are a part of every screw, every story. But beyond the name, I want you to know something. I'm not trying to replace you. I'm trying to continue your way of seeing life. If anything happens to you, I want you to leave knowing that the Santa Marina name is no longer a company. It's an example. And that what you gave me, your toughness, your silence, and your faith, I am now sharing with those who never had a father to guide them. Thank you for teaching me to fall without giving up. With love, David." I held the letter in my hands. The wind carried a dry leaf from the oak tree, and I felt a lump in my throat. It wasn't sadness. It was pure gratitude. The kind you only feel when you understand that life, with all its mistakes, made sense. That night, I lit a candle in the workshop. The glow illuminated the old blueprints, the faded portraits, and the box where I kept David's letters. I stayed looking at everything, as if reviewing the final pages of a book that no longer needed an epilogue. I thought about the years I spent fighting for a name, for a company, for respect. And I realized that in the end, the only thing that truly belonged to me was the way I loved, and the way I learned to be silent when words weren't enough. I took the letter, folded it, and put it away next to Lucy's cross necklace. "See, honey," I murmured. "We did it. There was no inheritance of money, but there was an inheritance of soul. And in this country, where so many die leaving nothing, that is more than enough." Outside, the moon reflected on the oak tree leaves. The air smelled of earth and promise. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and felt that for the first time, silence wasn't loneliness. It was company. The company of all those who are no longer here, but continue living in what one teaches with one's hands and by example. And so, between the echo of the wood and the whisper of the wind, Mr. Robert understood that true legacy is not measured in years or in money, but in the peace that remains when the soul finally reconciles with its history. The days slipped away like old corn kernels, slow, warm, full of memory. The workshop still smelled of freshly cut wood and dark roast coffee. The neighbors came to say hello, leave errands, or chat for a while. I received them with the calm of someone who no longer competes with time. But that morning, while sanding a cedar board, I felt dizzy. It wasn't strong, just a second of shadow, but enough to remind me that the body, like trees, also gives a warning before it falls. I sat down, took a deep breath, and looked at the oak tree. The tree was enormous, more alive than ever. Its branches swayed gently, and a nest hung among the leaves. A pair of sparrows flew in and out with straw in their beaks. That's life, I thought. You build your nest, you defend it, and one day you leave. The tree continues, and the song does too. In the afternoon, David arrived. He carried a folder in his hand and a serious, but not sad expression. "Are you feeling well, Dad?" he asked. "I feel old but at peace." He laughed. "If only you knew how many people would love to be that clear-headed." He sat across from me, opened the folder, and showed me a blueprint. "We're planning to open a new training center in the northern part of the country, in Boston." "That far?" I asked. "Yes, but this time I want to do it right. Slow, responsible, without excessive ambition." "And why are you telling me?" "Because I want you to decide whether we do it or not. You are still the source of all this." I smiled, shaking my head. "No, son. The source has changed location." "Where is it then?" "In every young person you learn to teach, without asking them to admire you." That sounds like something Mom would say. Maybe that's because now we both speak with the same voice. The silence enveloped us. The oak tree, the wind, the afternoon. Everything seemed part of a mass without a priest. A ceremony of reconciliation. Before leaving, David stopped at the door. "Dad, what will you do if you can no longer work?" "I'll keep teaching, even if it's just with words." "And if one day you can't speak?" "Then I'll let the silence speak for me." David nodded, and before getting into the truck, he turned around. "I promise to take care of the name, but above all, the story." "Do it without fear," I replied. Fear was never part of our trade. That night, I was alone in the workshop. The clock marked 9 o'clock, and outside the street was sleeping. On the table, an open notebook and an old pen. I began to write what I knew would be my last letter. "David, if you're reading this someday, don't be sad. Roots don't cry when the tree falls, because they know their job was to hold it up. Promise me you will continue teaching young people to work with clean hands and their heads held high. That you won't forget to offer coffee to anyone who arrives tired and hungry. Don't inherit my last name, inherit my way of seeing the world. And when the oak tree blooms in spring, you will know that I am still here among the leaves. Your father, Robert." I left the letter inside the box where I kept Lucy's photos and the first blueprints of the company. I turned off the lamp, went out to the yard, and sat under the oak tree. The sky was clear. The stars twinkled like embers. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of earth and wood, of a life fulfilled. That was the last night I slept in the workshop. At dawn, the neighbors found me lying in my recliner, my face serene and my hands clasped over my chest. The coffee was still warm on the table, the oak tree in the background letting soft leaves fall, as if bidding farewell to its gardener. And so ended the story of Mr. Robert Santamarina, the man who lost an empire to gain a soul, the man who taught that silence can be punishment, but also redemption. And when David arrived that morning, with tears and smiles intermingled, he finally understood his father's final lesson: that the true inheritance is not in possessions or titles, but in the peace with which one learns to say goodbye to the world. The day of the funeral dawned clear, with a sky so blue it hurt to look at. In the small neighborhood chapel, the neighbors filled the pews. Construction workers, drivers, mechanics, the same men Mr. Robert had once helped without asking for anything in return. Outside, the smell of fresh flowers mingled with that of cinnamon rolls and coffee that the neighbors prepared for the attendees. There were no luxuries, no expensive coffin, no prepared speeches, only silence. The same silence with which Mr. Robert had built, loved, and forgiven. David arrived early, in a dark suit and with a firm gaze. He didn't cry, not because he didn't feel pain, but because he knew his father would have hated to see tears where there should be gratitude. He placed an old photo on the coffin, him as a child, sitting in the Chevy Impala next to his father, both smiling in front of the company's first truck. Then he placed his hands on the wood and murmured, "Thank you, Dad." Nothing more, nothing less. Sarah from the foundation approached with a group of young people. They wore grease-stained uniforms and carried a wreath of sunflowers. "These were his favorite," she said. "He always said the sunflower doesn't look for the sun. It follows it." David smiled slightly. Exactly like him. The priest spoke briefly, without embellishments, repeating what everyone already knew: that Robert Santamarina was a man of his word, and that his silences had changed more lives than 1,000 sermons. Afterward, the impromptu choir sang Amazing Grace. The song filled the chapel, and for a moment, everyone present felt the air had a different weight, as if Mr. Robert's voice was still around, correcting details, making sure no one forgot what was important. At the end of the ceremony, David asked to carry the coffin in his own truck, the one with the Lucy's Foundation logo. He drove slowly to the Fort Worth Cemetery, where his mother rested. The road was the same one his father had taken so many times to deliver merchandise. Now, finally, it was a journey of rest. When they lowered the coffin, David deposited a handful of earth and placed a bronze bolt on the tombstone, a symbol of the trade that united them. "This bolt," he said softly, "is the proof that nothing is built without unity." Sarah took his hand. No one spoke. Only the wind blew through the trees. That afternoon, everyone returned to the workshop. The doors were still open, the coffee was still hot, and on the table was the notebook where Mr. Robert wrote his thoughts. On the last page, in firm handwriting, there was a single phrase: "When the son understands, the father rests." David read it aloud, and then he understood that his father hadn't left entirely. He was still there, in every tool marked with his initials, in every young person learning to earn their bread with clean hands. The oak tree in the yard moved in the wind, dropping leaves like blessings. David looked up and murmured, "Rest, old man. I understand now." As night fell, they lit a bonfire in front of the workshop. The young people from the foundation shared anecdotes they had only heard secondhand. The first deliveries, the days without money, the laughter in the face of adversity. And when the fire died down, the sky filled with stars. David thought that perhaps one of them had the sparkle of his father's eyes. He looked toward the oak tree and for an instant, he swore he heard Mr. Roberts' voice say, "Don't stop, son. The work is just beginning." And he smiled, because he understood that even in death, his father was still teaching. And so, between the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind, the story of Mr. Robert Santamarina became a living legend. Not a legend of fortune, but of dignity. Because here, men like him don't die. They just become part of the ground that grows those who come after. A few months passed since Mr. Roberts' departure. The workshop still stood, although its doors now opened only on weekends, when David and Sarah came with the foundation's young people to keep it alive. They didn't modify it. They didn't paint the walls or change the tools. Everything remained exactly as he had left it. The smell of wood, the old radio, the thermos with coffee, and the bench with his name carved with a knife. It was their way of honoring him, not with monuments, but with use, with life. The oak tree grew stronger than ever. Under its shade, David placed a small bronze plaque. Here worked a man who taught that silence also builds. Every time the wind blew through the branches, the leaves sounded as if they were applauding. And everyone who passed by, neighbors, apprentices, former employees, stopped for a moment, looked up, and smiled. It was as if Mr. Robert were still there, observing in silence, making sure no one forgot why everything began. Lucy's foundation had grown beyond what anyone imagined. There were centers in Dallas, Boston, Philadelphia, and Miami, all managed by young people who were once students in the first workshops. Each location had a discreet portrait of Mr. Robert, not as a founder, but as a guide. A man without a pedestal, but with roots. One day, during the inauguration of the new center in Miami, David took the microphone in front of the press, investors, and students. His voice trembled at first, but then it steadied with the tone of someone who speaks from the truth. My father was never a man of titles. He didn't leave mansions or million-dollar accounts, but he left us something worth more. A way to live with decency. He taught me that a loose bolt can cause a disaster, just as a misspoken lie can destroy a life. That's why every young person who leaves our workshops doesn't just learn a trade. They learn not to forget where they came from. There was applause, yes. But what David felt wasn't pride. It was peace, because in that moment, he knew his father hadn't died. He had simply transformed into purpose. That night, David returned to Dallas. He went straight to the workshop, alone. The place was dark, but the oak tree was still there, firm and immense like a guardian. He sat on the bench and took out an old notebook, the same one where his father wrote his thoughts. He opened it, and in his own handwriting, he added a final sentence below Mr. Roberts' last line. When the father rests, the son begins his shift. Then he closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf next to Lucy's photo, and left the workshop door ajar. The wind entered, gently moved the oak tree leaves, and the echo of the wood creaked like a familiar voice saying, "Well done, son." The next day, when the sun appeared over the neighborhood roofs, the first group of apprentices arrived to begin a new day. They turned on the radio, the same device Mr. Robert never wanted to replace, and an old ballad played. The young people laughed, unaware that that sound, that crackle of the old station, was the way the teacher greeted them from somewhere higher up. And so, the story of Mr. Robert Santamarina did not end with his death. It became an invisible chain that united generations of working hands, humble hearts, and wise silences. Because in a country where so many build without being seen, his legacy proved that dignity also leaves traces, even if they aren't signed with ink, but with effort. The oak tree still stands. The leaves fall every autumn, but they sprout again. And as long as there is someone who learns to work and to love without expecting applause, Mr. Robert, the man of silence, will continue to live. In every hammer blow, in every well-placed bolt, in every life rebuilt with one's own hands.